Everyone in the neighborhood heard the creak of that fence before dawn, but no one dared to ask why. At 5:30 in the morning, when the street was still wrapped in silence and the mist clung to the lawns, that sound meant one thing: Doyle Mason was at it again. I was still half asleep, pouring cereal into a chipped bowl when I saw Grandpa shift in his rocking chair out on the porch. He didn't move much, didn't need to. His eyes tracked shadows like a soldier still on watch, though his body had grown old and stiff with the years. He muttered almost to himself, "There he goes again." And sure enough, Doyle was scaling our backyard fence, clipboard and phone clutched like weapons. He dropped onto the gravel, boots crunching loud in the quiet morning, and started snapping photos of Grandpa's tomato plants. His face wore that self-righteous sneer he always carried, as if catching people in sin was his life's mission. Imagine it, 75-year-old veteran growing tomatoes in his backyard, now accused of a crime against community aesthetics. That's what Doyle called it, a crime. My fists clenched around the spoon in my hand. I wanted to storm out to demand he stop, to tell him the yard wasn't his business. But Grandpa only raised one weathered hand without turning his head. Calm, steady, like he had been waiting for this moment all along. "Patience," he whispered. "Let a fool show himself long enough and he'll write his own ending." That was Grandpa's way. Quiet resolve where others shouted, measured when others broke. It was the same stillness he carried from the war, the kind that made men trust him in chaos. But Doyle, he was chaos itself. This wasn't the first time. Twice before we'd caught him circling the shed, rattling the lock like a burglar. Once, I swear, I saw his shadow in our yard at midnight. And when Grandpa reported him, the HOA president brushed it off with a smile, calling him enthusiastic. Enthusiastic. Doyle wasn't a volunteer, wasn't elected, wasn't even asked. He just decided he was the HOA patrol. Clipboard, ruler, and phone camera, that was his badge. And now he was breaking trespassing laws under state code, but the HOA hid behind words like internal enforcement. Grandpa didn't buy it. He called the sheriff's office. They sympathized, but the law was a gray area. Unless Doyle was caught in the act, right then and there, it would be our word against his. And in neighborhoods like ours, words twisted easy. That's when I noticed something shift in Grandpa. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with decision. For 3 days straight, he disappeared into the garage, humming low country tunes while I fetched him tools. Sparks danced behind the cracked door. The smell of hot metal and sawdust lingered in the air. He was building something Doyle wouldn't see coming. By the 4th day, our iron gate wasn't the same. I didn't understand all the wires, the clamps, the neat coil of conduit, but Grandpa explained it was perfectly legal. A low-voltage system registered under the electrical code. He even mounted a bright yellow sign on the gate. Warning, electrified. Trespassers will be shocked. The sign felt like enough to me, but Grandpa knew better. Doyle wasn't the kind of man who believed in warnings. He believed in catching people off guard. And right on schedule, the morning mist rolled back in and the fence creaked once more. Doyle climbed like a thief, muttering to himself about violations, eyes locked on the tomatoes. But this time, the porch wasn't the only one watching. I crouched behind the window, heart pounding, breath caught in my throat. He reached for the gate, his gloved hand wrapped around the steel, and then snap. The sound was sharp, electric, alive. Doyle yelped, high and raw, like a dog caught by surprise. His body jolted backward, arms flailing, and he landed flat in the dirt. For a moment he lay there, stunned, blinking at the sky as if he didn't understand what had happened. Then he scrambled to his feet, limping, stumbling toward the street, clutching his hand like it had betrayed him. Grandpa didn't move an inch. He just leaned back in that chair, coffee steaming in his hand, eyes glinting with something between satisfaction and warning. "That," he said softly, "was the sound of justice." And just like that, the story of the neighborhood changed. By noon, whispers spread across Maple Court. Doyle Mason, the self-appointed enforcer, the man who measured grass with a ruler, who peeked through curtains at night, was seen limping home, red-faced and humiliated. Neighbors who had once laughed nervously at his antics now stifled real laughter behind their hands. But Doyle wasn't the kind to take a hit quietly. He never had been. And as Grandpa sat steady on the porch, rocking slow and deliberate, I could see it in Doyle's eyes across the street. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. They say pride makes a man blind. And that morning, as Doyle Mason dragged himself down Maple Court with mud on his jeans and shame on his face, every neighbor saw what he didn't. His war with Grandpa had only just begun. By lunchtime, the whispers had become a roar. People gathered in clusters along driveways, shaking their heads, covering their mouths to hide their smirks. Some even laughed openly. For years, Doyle had stalked the neighborhood like a watchdog without a leash, snapping photos of chipped paint, measuring lawns with his precious ruler, accusing mothers of leaving bicycles out too long. Now the watchdog had been shocked by the very fence he tried to climb. But Doyle wasn't a man to retreat. By noon, word spread that an emergency HOA meeting had been called. Grandpa brushed crumbs off his shirt and said he'd go. I went with him, nervous, because I knew Doyle wasn't going to let humiliation settle quietly. The HOA meeting room smelled like stale coffee and furniture polish. Linda Clay, the president, sat at the head of the long table, pearls glinting under fluorescent lights, her smile tight as if pasted on. Beside her, Doyle cradled his arm in a sling. A sling. He looked like a martyr at trial, his eyes burning with self-righteous fury. He jabbed a finger across the table, voice trembling with performance. This man is endangering the neighborhood. He built a weapon disguised as a gate. That thing nearly killed me. The room murmured. A few neighbors leaned forward, curious, some skeptical. Grandpa didn't flinch. He leaned in, calm, steady, and placed a folded paper on the table. That, he said evenly, is a state-issued electrical permit, fully legal, signed and documented, and the warning sign is posted clearly on the gate. Linda adjusted her pearls, her smile stiffening. Legal or not, Mr. Thompson, it goes against the spirit of community living. We cannot have aggressive installations. The HOA reserves the right to regulate such structures. Grandpa's voice dropped lower, heavy, the kind of tone that silences a room. Regulate? Sure. Trespass? No, this man has entered my yard 3 times without permission. That's a crime under North Carolina law. I'm done warning him. Next time I'll press charges, and I'll let a judge decide. The shift was instant. You could feel the weight of the words settle across the room. Neighbors who had stayed quiet before began to nod. One woman raised her hand, voice trembling as she spoke. Doyle came into my backyard last month, measured my shrubs. I thought I was the only one. Another neighbor chimed in. He photographed my kids' bikes, called them an eyesore. The room rippled with voices. Doyle's face grew redder with every word, his sling looking more pathetic by the second. He tried to shout over them, but the tide had turned. For once, people weren't whispering behind closed doors. They were speaking out loud right in front of him. Linda banged the gavel, desperate to regain control. This meeting is not for accusations. But Grandpa cut in, his voice like iron. Yes, ma'am, it is. Because Doyle isn't enforcing rules. He's feeding an obsession. And if this board keeps protecting him, you're just as responsible when it goes too far. The silence that followed was heavy. I looked around the room and saw something I hadn't seen before, respect. For Grandpa. Neighbors were no longer afraid to side with him. They'd seen the truth, and Doyle's mask was slipping. But humiliation has a way of hardening into vengeance. That night, as the sun dipped low and the crickets began their song, Doyle's dented pickup truck rolled slowly down our street. He circled the block once, twice, headlights sweeping across our porch. He didn't stop. He didn't speak, but his presence said everything. Grandpa sipped his coffee from his thermos, rocking steady in his chair, eyes sharp and unblinking as the truck crawled by. He didn't need words. The porch light cast him in silhouette, unmoving, unreadable. I stood inside by the window, heart thudding. Something about the way Doyle slowed in front of our driveway, staring at the gate as if it were a challenge he couldn't let go, made my stomach twist. Grandpa noticed it too. He didn't smile this time. He just said, almost to himself, "A cornered man is the most dangerous kind." And as Doyle's taillights disappeared into the dark, I realized this fight was far from over. The shock hadn't stopped him. It had only lit the fuse. The third night was when everything changed. I woke to the sound of rustling metal, faint but sharp in the stillness. At first I thought it was the wind, But then I heard the crunch of boots on gravel, the low mutter of curses carried through the dark. My chest tightened. Doyle was back. From the window, I could see him crouched by the gate, flashlight in one hand, bolt cutters in the other. His face was twisted in concentration, lips moving like he was rehearsing excuses for later. The man didn't look like a neighbor. He looked like a burglar, like someone desperate enough to cross any line. But what chilled me most was Doyle. It was Grandpa. He was already waiting. There he sat, calm in his rocking chair on the porch, thermos of coffee by his side, eyes locked on Doyle as if he'd been expecting this exact moment. And when I crept closer to the screen door, I heard his voice, low and steady. "Watch this, kid." The cutters clamped down on the steel with a click, and then came the hum. Grandpa thumbed a small remote in his hand, and the gate lit alive with low-voltage current. Doyle jerked backward, a strangled yelp tearing through the night. The cutters slipped from his hands, clattering into the mud as his body jolted like he'd touched a hornet's nest. He stumbled, flailing, landing flat on his back in the dirt. Mud smeared his shirt, sweat clung to his face, but instead of retreating, he scrambled for his phone. His voice cracked through the quiet. 911, attempted murder. This lunatic is trying to kill me with an illegal fence. My stomach dropped. He was lying, again. Grandpa didn't move, didn't argue. He simply lifted his own phone, already recording. Every curse, every slip, every desperate flail, it was all caught in perfect clarity. He leaned back, voice calm as the night itself. "Trespassing again," he muttered. "And this time it's on camera." 5 minutes later, red and blue lights washed across the yard. Neighbors stirred, curtains shifted. The entire street seemed to hold its breath as two officers stepped out, hands hovering near their holsters. They looked first at Doyle, muddy, trembling, clutching his arm, then at Grandpa, who sat like a sentinel on the porch. "Sir," one officer asked, eyes scanning the gate, "is there an active electrical device here?" "Yes," Grandpa answered without flinching. "Registered, permitted, posted with warnings, and recorded." He slid the laminated permit across the porch table like it was nothing more than a grocery receipt. Then he handed over his phone, video still rolling. The officers watched Doyle climb, watched him cut, watched him fry himself in his own arrogance. When the video ended, one of them looked up deadpan. "So, you trespassed?" Doyle sputtered, voice cracking. "No, I was conducting an inspection for the HOA." "At midnight?" the other officer asked. "With bolt cutters." The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. The law was clear. Doyle wasn't a watchdog. He wasn't an enforcer. He was a criminal, trespassing, vandalism, attempted theft, and now filing a false police report. The cuffs clicked around his wrists right there in front of the glowing gate. Neighbors had gathered by then, drawn by the flashing lights, by the spectacle of Doyle Mason finally caught in his own trap. For the first time, they weren't whispering. They were clapping, applauding justice as Doyle shouted about conspiracies and vendettas, his words swallowed by the night. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving Doyle as he was led to the cruiser. And then he turned to me, voice low, carrying a weight I'll never forget. "Sometimes, son, justice just needs a little electricity." The door shut on Doyle's protests. His reputation shattered, his so-called badge of authority stripped away. And as the cruiser rolled off into the night, I realized something. The fight was no longer just between Doyle and Grandpa. It had become a reckoning for the whole neighborhood. Everyone thought it was over when the cruiser drove away that night. But sometimes, the end of one fight is just the beginning of something bigger. The next morning, Maple Court felt different. People weren't peeking from behind blinds anymore. They were outside, watering plants, sweeping porches, walking dogs they hadn't walked in weeks. And every single one of them stopped when they saw Grandpa. Some just nodded, others smiled. One man even said, "'Bout time someone stood up to him." It was like the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath under Doyle's shadow, and now, finally, they could exhale. But Doyle's shadow didn't vanish. Not completely. His house sat 2 doors down, blinds drawn tight, truck missing from the driveway. And though people whispered that the HOA would finally strip him of his so-called patrol, Grandpa wasn't celebrating. He rocked steady in his chair, sipping black coffee, eyes fixed on that empty driveway like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. By evening, it did. The HOA board sent out an email, short, clinical, but clear. Doyle Mason had been suspended from all community enforcement activities. Effective immediately. Most neighbors cheered. Phones buzzed, messages lit up. For the first time in years, people laughed without fear of Doyle suddenly appearing with a clipboard in hand. But Grandpa didn't laugh. He folded the email printout, slid it into his jacket pocket, and muttered, "Suspended isn't the same as gone." And he was right. 3 nights later, I spotted headlights sweeping across our fence at 2 in the morning. The dented pickup was back, crawling down the street slower than a funeral procession. Doyle was home. He didn't step out, didn't knock. He just idled in front of our driveway, engine humming low, before rolling on into the dark. The next morning, Grandpa found footprints in the dew by the fence. Fresh, heavy, Doyle hadn't just circled, he'd come close, too close. Grandpa didn't call the sheriff this time. He didn't call the HOA either. He just sat a little straighter in that rocking chair, eyes sharper, voice lower. A man stripped of power will claw for it twice as hard. That's when he's most dangerous. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself Doyle was done. But the neighborhood's silence carried a tension I couldn't ignore. Everyone had seen him humiliated. Everyone had seen him arrested. And now, every shadow on the street felt like his revenge waiting to take shape. 2 days later, the HOA announced an all-residents meeting, mandatory attendance. Some said it was about Doyle. Others whispered it was about Grandpa. Either way, the air was thick with unease when we walked into that fluorescent-lit hall. The board sat stiff at the front. Linda Clay wore her pearls again, smile tight, knuckles white around her notes. Doyle wasn't at the table this time. He sat near the back, arms crossed, jaw clenched, eyes burning holes into Grandpa. Linda cleared her throat. "We're here to restore order to this community. Recent events have escalated unnecessarily." Her words hung heavy, escalated unnecessarily. As if Doyle hadn't climbed fences, as if Grandpa hadn't been protecting his own yard. But before she could go further, a neighbor stood. A quiet woman, someone who had always avoided attention. Her voice trembled at first, but she found her strength. "Doyle trespassed into my yard last month. I was too afraid to say anything, but I'm not afraid now." Murmurs rippled. Another man spoke up. "He called the police on me once, said my car was too old to be parked on the street. I thought I'd lose my job if I missed work fixing it." One by one, voices rose, stories spilled. Fear that had lived in silence now rang in the open. Doyle's face flushed deeper with every word, his fists clenching, jaw tight. And through it all, Grandpa stayed silent, calm, watching. Finally, Doyle shot to his feet, voice booming. "You think this man is your hero? He's a menace. He's turned this neighborhood against its own rules." But no one clapped. No one nodded. The room had shifted. People weren't afraid of Doyle anymore. They were tired. Tired of being ruled by fear. Tired of living under his false authority. Linda banged the gavel, trying to wrestle back control. But the truth had already broken loose, and there was no locking it up again. When we walked home that night, the air felt lighter. But Grandpa's steps stayed heavy. He knew what I hadn't yet learned. When a man like Doyle loses his grip, he doesn't let go quietly. He fights harder, dirtier, desperate. And the real storm was still coming. Everyone thought the storm had passed after that meeting. But storms don't always roar when they arrive. Sometimes they creep in silently, like a shadow slipping under a door. It was just past midnight when I woke to the faint crunch of gravel outside. At first I thought it was nothing, but then I heard it again, slow, heavy steps near the gate. My heart thudded. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see. And there he was, Doyle. Flashlight clenched between his teeth, bolt cutters gripped tight in his hands. His face was twisted with something ugly, anger mixed with desperation. His eyes darted wild, like he knew this was his last chance to win back control. But he wasn't alone. Grandpa was waiting. Not hiding, not crouching. Waiting, sitting in his rocking chair like always, as though midnight were no different from noon. Steam curled from his coffee mug, his gaze never left Doyle. For a moment, Doyle froze. The two of them locked eyes across the yard, and you could almost feel the history between them. One man obsessed with power, the other holding his ground with quiet dignity. Then Doyle lunged at the gate. The cutters bit down on the steel, sparks flashing in the beam of his flashlight. His muttering was frantic, almost unhinged. "Illegal, dangerous, I'll prove it, I'll prove it." Grandpa didn't move, he didn't raise his voice. He simply pulled the small remote from his pocket, a single click. The hum of electricity surged through the wires, and Doyle's body jolted hard, a strangled cry ripping through the night. He dropped the cutters, stumbling backward into the mud, arms flailing. He cursed, spat, scrambled like a man clawing at air. And then came the twist. Doyle didn't run this time. He pulled his phone, his hands shaking, and dialed 911 right there on the ground. His voice was shrill, cracking with desperation. "Help! Attempted murder! He's trying to electrocute me!" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was twisting it, turning himself into the victim yet again. My stomach knotted. Grandpa didn't panic. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. He simply lifted his phone and angled the screen toward the gate. The camera was already rolling, capturing every second in sharp clarity, the trespassing, the cutters, the shock, the lies. When the red and blue lights washed across our yard minutes later, Doyle played his part to the hilt. Muddy, trembling, clutching his arm like a wounded soldier, he pointed at Grandpa with wild eyes. "He's dangerous, he tried to kill me." But the officers didn't just hear Doyle's words, they saw the truth. Grandpa stood calm as stone, sliding a laminated permit across the porch table. "Registered, legal, posted with warnings," he said evenly. Then he handed them his phone. "And recorded." The officers watched, every cut, every trespass, every jolt. When the video ended, one of them turned to Doyle, expression flat. "So, you broke in?" Doyle sputtered, voice high, cracking. "No, I was conducting an inspection." "At midnight?" the second officer asked. "With bolt cutters?" That was it, no excuses left. The cuffs clicked shut around Doyle's wrists. He screamed, shouted about conspiracies, claimed the whole street was against him. But this time, nobody looked away. Neighbors lined the sidewalks, whispering, some even clapping softly as the patrol car door slammed shut. Grandpa sat back down, rocking slow, his eyes on me as the cruiser pulled away. "Sometimes, son," he said quietly, "the only way to stop a man from poisoning a community is to let him choke on his own lies." I didn't say a word. I just stood there, heart pounding, realizing Doyle hadn't just lost the fight. He had lost the story. And in our neighborhood, that was the one thing he'd never get back. The neighborhood had never been louder than the morning after Doyle's arrest. Not because people were shouting, but because, for the first time in years, they weren't whispering. Everywhere I looked, neighbors were out on porches, leaning on fences, laughing in open daylight. Conversations that had once stopped the second Doyle walked by now flowed free, like chains had been cut loose. But freedom carried its own weight. People weren't just laughing, they were confessing. Stories spilled like floodwater. "I caught him taking pictures of my recycling bins," one woman said, shaking her head. "Said the labels weren't facing forward." Another neighbor chimed in. "He wrote a warning on my windshield once, claimed my tires weren't HOA compliant. Can you believe that?" The truth spread, and with it, the realization that Doyle hadn't just harassed one family. He'd poisoned the whole block, and for the first time, everyone was brave enough to admit it. Grandpa didn't join the chatter. He sat in his rocker, quiet as ever, coffee steaming in his hands, but I saw the faintest trace of a smile in the corner of his mouth. Not triumph, not gloating, just relief. Relief that people were finally waking up. The HOA board, though, they weren't smiling. By the end of the week, Linda Clay sent out a formal notice. A special session to address the unfortunate incident. The words felt cold, detached, like the board was trying to rewrite the story. When we walked into the hall, the air was thick with tension. Neighbors filled every chair, every corner, standing shoulder to shoulder. And there at the front sat the board, stiff, uneasy, their polished smiles stretched thin. Doyle wasn't beside them this time. He was at the far end, jaw tight, eyes burning holes into Grandpa. Linda cleared her throat, pearls catching the fluorescent light. We understand emotions have run high, but let's remember this is about restoring harmony. Harmony, a man from the back scoffed. Harmony doesn't come from letting one man terrorize the neighborhood. Murmurs of agreement rolled through the room. Another voice cut in sharper. We trusted this board, and you let him act like a cop when he wasn't one. For once, Linda's smile faltered. Grandpa didn't rush to speak. He waited, letting the tide turn on its own, and it did. One by one, people stood. They weren't whispering now, they were shouting. Stories, complaints, evidence. Years of frustration poured out until the walls echoed with truth the board couldn't ignore. Finally, Grandpa rose. His voice was calm, steady, the same voice that had carried me through fear more times than I could count. I didn't build that gate to punish anyone. I built it to protect my home. The law gave me that right. But when law fails, community must take its place. And a community is only as strong as the truth it allows to live. Silence followed, not because people disagreed, but because the words sank deep. Doyle slammed his fist on the table, voice cracking. This is a witch hunt. You're all turning on me because of him? He jabbed a finger at Grandpa, spittle flying. He's the real danger here. But this time, no one stood with him. Not a single neighbor. Even the board members shifted in their seats, their silence louder than any defense. That was the moment Doyle realized he wasn't feared anymore. And a man who thrives on fear has nothing left when it's gone. On the walk home, the streetlights flickered above us, the air cool against the night. Grandpa said nothing for a long time. Then he finally spoke, his voice low, almost tired. People don't always see the difference between power and respect. Doyle thought they were the same thing. Tonight, he learned the truth. And though I didn't fully understand it then, I could feel it. Doyle's fight wasn't over, but his grip on the neighborhood was gone. No one expected Doyle to give up quietly, but no one expected how far he would go either. The night it happened, the air was heavy with silence. Even the crickets seemed to hold back, like they sensed something was coming. I was half asleep when the sound of an engine rumbling low pulled me to the window. Headlights cut across our lawn, slow, deliberate, stopping right at the edge of our driveway. It was Doyle. His dented pickup idled there, its beams glaring against the iron gate. For a moment he just sat, hands clenched tight on the wheel, his face pale in the glow. Then the driver's door creaked open. He wasn't carrying a clipboard this time. He wasn't carrying a phone or a ruler. In his hands was something heavier, a crowbar. My breath caught. He wasn't here to take pictures anymore. He was here to break something or someone. Grandpa was already on the porch, not packing, not hiding. Just sitting in his chair, coffee mug beside him, eyes locked on Doyle like a hawk watching a rattlesnake. He didn't call the police. He didn't even stand. He just waited. Doyle stalked toward the gate, crowbar swinging at his side, muttering curses that carried in the night air. You think you beat me? Think you humiliated me? I'll show you all. He raised the crowbar high and slammed it down against the gate. The clang echoed like a gunshot. Sparks jumped. The sign rattled. He swung again, teeth bared, spit flying. And then the hum started. Grandpa didn't even look down as his thumb clicked the remote. The wires came alive, a low, steady current coursing through the steel. Doyle swung once more, the crowbar connecting with the electrified gate. The jolt sent him reeling, a guttural cry tearing from his throat as he staggered back into the dirt. But this time he didn't run. He scrambled up, face twisted in rage, crowbar shaking in his trembling hands. I'll break it, I'll break you, he screamed. That's when the floodlights kicked on. Grandpa had wired them days ago, anticipating this exact moment. The entire yard lit up like a stage, every detail exposed. Doyle standing wild-eyed with his weapon, neighbors stirring from their homes, blinds pulling back, phones recording. For the first time, Doyle saw what we had all seen for years, himself. Not as a protector, not as an enforcer, but as a desperate man unraveling in front of the entire community. He roared, swinging one last time. The gate held. The current snapped. The crowbar flew from his hands, clattering across the gravel. And then, as if the weight of it all finally broke him, Doyle fell to his knees, clutching his head, shouting nonsense into the night. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had already called. This time it wasn't us, it was the neighbors. By the time the deputies arrived, Doyle was on the ground, shaking, his fury drained into sobs that sounded more pitiful than dangerous. The crowbar lay forgotten. The gate still stood, humming faintly, unbroken. The officers didn't need explanations. They didn't ask questions. They cuffed him without a word, guiding him toward the cruiser under the blinding glare of the floodlights. Neighbors gathered, not in whispers this time, but in open voices. Some clapped again. Some just shook their heads, but all of them saw the truth. Doyle hadn't been protecting the community. He had been tearing it apart. Grandpa finally rose from his chair. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just looked at Doyle being pushed into the backseat and said, barely above a whisper, "Power built on fear always ends the same way, alone." And as the cruiser rolled off into the night, taking Doyle with it, I realized something I'd never understood before. This fight had never just been about a gate. It had been about dignity, about the line between protecting what's yours and letting someone else decide it for you. And Grandpa, he never let anyone cross that line. Everyone thought they knew how Doyle Mason's story would end. But endings don't come with fireworks. They come quietly, like a door shutting for the last time. The night after Doyle was taken away, Maple Court was different. No circling trucks. No shadows at the fence. No clipboard flashing in the sun, just silence. A silence that felt like peace. Neighbors walked their dogs without glancing over their shoulders. Kids played basketball in the driveways without their mothers rushing to pull them inside. Even the lawns looked greener, freer, like they weren't being judged anymore. For the first time in years, the neighborhood belonged to the people again, not to Doyle's clipboard. The HOA board tried to save face. They sent out a carefully worded letter. Mr. Mason will no longer be participating in community oversight. No apology, no responsibility, just words. But nobody cared anymore. The board's power had cracked the same night Doyle fell to his knees in front of the whole block. Because once fear is broken, it doesn't come back. Grandpa didn't say much that week. He kept his routine, the porch, the coffee, the steady rocking. But I could see it in the way he watched the street. He wasn't just guarding a gate anymore. He was guarding something bigger, the dignity of the entire neighborhood. One evening, just as the sun bled gold over the rooftops, a few neighbors gathered at our porch. They didn't come to complain, they came to thank him. A woman who had once been too afraid to speak said softly, "You gave us our voices back." Another added, "We didn't know how to stand up until you did." Grandpa just nodded, eyes on the horizon. He never took credit, he never wanted it. All he said was, "A community isn't built by the loudest man in the room, it's built by the ones who refuse to bow to him." The words sank deep. But Doyle's story didn't fade instantly. For weeks, whispers floated about charges filed, about court dates, about fines stacking higher than his pride could pay. Some said he tried to plead with the board. Others said he planned to move away. No one really knew and no one really cared. Because in the end, Doyle Mason was no longer the man people feared. He was the man people pitied. And pity, that's worse than fear. The last time I ever saw him was months later. His truck was gone, his yard overgrown, blinds still shut. He stood at the curb with a single suitcase, shoulders slumped, waiting for a ride that never came. He looked smaller then, not the watchdog of Maple Court, not the self-appointed cop, just a man broken by the weight of his own obsession. Grandpa watched from the porch. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just sipped his coffee and said, almost like a prayer, "Justice doesn't always come from the law. Sometimes it comes from the way people remember you." And he was right. Because people didn't remember Doyle as a protector. They remembered him as the man who trespassed, who measured grass, who broke into yards with bolt cutters and lies. His legacy wasn't power. It was shame. As the seasons changed, so did the neighborhood. The laughter grew louder. The streets felt lighter. And every time I walked past that iron gate, I remembered the night Doyle touched it and thought he was untouchable. Grandpa's words still echo in my head. "Sometimes, son, justice just needs a little electricity." But I know now it wasn't about the wires. It wasn't about the gate. It was about something deeper, the quiet strength of a man who refused to bend. A reminder that dignity isn't given, it's defended. And when the history of our street is told, Doyle Mason will be nothing more than a cautionary tale. But Grandpa will be the reason the neighborhood finally learned to breathe free. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.